Hello and welcome. My name is Brandi Joan. You can find me at Brandi Joan across all platforms, and today we are sewing up one of my summer 2024 designs with McCall's number M8503. So let's get into it.
And as always, before you start, don't forget to check the back of your pattern packet for all of your sizes and supplies needed. Before we begin sewing any of the front pieces together, we want to stay stitch the side edges of the bodice front. Then pin the bodice side fronts to the side edges of the bodice front. Then sew them both in place using a 5/8 seam allowance. Now we're going to form casings for the boning by pressing the seams towards the bodice front and stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the stitch line. Next, stay stitch the side edge of the bodice back. Then, pin the bodice side back to the side edge of the bodice back, placing them right sides together and then sewing them in place using a 5/8 seam allowance. Then press the seam allowance towards the bodice back, and then we're going to top stitch a 1/4 inch away from the edge, the same way that we did the front piece, to create a casing for the boning. Now sew the front to the back bodice along the side seams, and again we're going to create a casing for the boning by sewing 1/4 inch away from that seam line. Before you move on to inserting the boning, make sure you give everything another good press. Then grab your boning and cut it to the length of each casing, minus about an inch or so. And before inserting your elastic, it helps to round out the edges of the boning, or use something like tape on the ends to help them glide through easier. Now that all of our boning has been inserted, we're going to, with the wrong sides together, pin the back facing to the back edge of the bodice back, matching the notches and small dots, and baste along that back seam line. Then top stitch the bodice back 3/8 from the basting. This is going to create our final casing for the boning, then insert the boning the same way that you did the others. Now we're moving on to the casing for the elastic. To form the casing, we're going to fold the armband in half lengthwise, baste the notched edge, then cut the elastic to the length of the elastic guide, insert the elastic into the casing, having the edges both be even, and baste the ends on your machine. Now bring your bodice back over and on the outside, pin the armband to the armhole edges of the bodice, matching the symbols, and baste it in place on both sides. Making sure that the raw edges of the fabric are facing up towards the top of the bodice and not down towards the hem. Now bring your flounce piece over and reinforce the inner edge of the circle by stay stitching it. Then, to hem the outer edge of the flounce, we're going to press under 1/4 inch, stitch as close to the pressed edge as possible. I do find it helpful to sew a basting stitch along the edge to then use to help turn up the edge of the fabric, so I did that first, as you can see here. Then trim very close to the stitching without cutting through it. Turn it in again along the trim edge and stitch it in place one more time. Then hem the back edges of the flounce the same way that you did the curved bottom edge. Now bring your bodice back over and with the wrong sides up, pin the flounce to the upper edge of the armband, matching the small dots and notches. Then clip the flounce where it's necessary and baste, stitching between the small clips. Now turn the whole flounce out to the outside and with the right sides up, pin the flounce to the upper edges of the bodice, matching the centers, notches, and the small dots, and baste that in place. And for now, we're moving on to the skirt. So we're going to stitch the skirt left front to the skirt front, matching the notches, leaving below the large dot open for the slit. Then grab your 2 skirt back pieces and place them right sides together along the center back seam and stitch down at least an inch below the notch all the way down to the hem. Now we're moving on to the zipper, so open your zipper teeth and lightly press the tape using a cool iron to help push the zipper teeth out. At this time, you're also going to want to press the seam allowance along the zipper opening of the skirt. Then on the outside, pin the right side of the zipper face down on the right side of the zipper opening. Have the coil along the seam line and the tape within the seam allowance, and the top of the stop 3/4 of an inch below the zipper. You can hand baste this in place before sewing it, or you can bring it right over to your machine and use your zipper foot to sew it in place. Bring your skirt back over to your table and make sure that the zipper still zips up now that one side has been sewn. Then repeat all of those steps with the remaining side of the zipper. Once again, you're going to want to make sure that your zipper still zips up and that nothing is visible from the outside. Once everything looks good, go ahead and sew up the rest of that seam allowance below the zipper, making sure to start where your previous stitch line ends. Next, sew the front and back skirt right sides together along the side seams, then gather the entire upper edge of the skirt. Make sure to adjust the gathers to your liking, then you're going to pin the skirt to the lower edge of the bodice, matching the centers, the notches, adjusting the gathers as you go, making sure everything is evenly distributed, then sew it together along the entire seam. Trim and press the seam allowance up towards the bodice. Once those straps are sewn on, go ahead and set that aside for later, and we're going to sew all of our lining pieces the exact same way that we did our main fabric, except we are not going to be adding any boning. Because of the fabric I was using, I decided to add my interfacing to my lining pieces, so it was a bit thicker, which means I definitely had to clip all of the curved edges, so keep that in mind if you have a bulkier side of your fabric. While giving everything on the lining a good press, turn the seam allowance on the bottom edge of the lining up 3/8 of an inch. And now we're going to, with right sides together, pin the lining to the bodice, matching all of the symbols and notches, stitching along the upper armhole, the back edge, being careful not to catch any of the armband or the flounce while stitching it all together. Trim and then understitch as far as you can go. Now fold your lining over to the inside of the garment, and we're going to slip stitch the folded under edge of the lining right in place of the previous stitch line you made while sewing the skirt to the bodice. Now that your bodice has been sewn up, we're going to apply the grommets to the back of the dress using the small dots indicated on the pattern. I inserted my grommets using a cam snaps press. Now we're going to make a 5/8 narrow hem at the lower edge of the dress and at the slit opening, tapering to nothing above the large dot. To finish it off, pivot 1/4 of an inch above the large dot while stitching. And that is it. I hope you love your new dress, and I will see you next time.